Welcome, everybody. I want to welcome you to this special session on climate assemblies, lessons learned and results from around the world and from Washington State. My name is Dan Seaman. I'm the moderator today. I currently work with American Forests as their senior climate advisor, working and supporting the U.S. Climate Alliance on National Working Lands initiatives. Many of you may remember me from my time at Washington DNR, where I led a lot of the climate and carbon initiatives there. The structure of the session today, we're going to have 4 10-minute presentations, and then we'll have about 15 minutes for Q&A afterwards. To kick this off, just wanted to offer a few thoughts here. I remember when I first heard about the climate assemblies when I was at Washington DNR, and I thought, that seems kind of naive that people who have never been working on this before and sort of bringing together a bunch of people who don't know about all the technical details could really solve the problems that all of the experts in government and in nonprofits and such have not been able to solve. But then I thought about the fact that we really hadn't been able to solve this over the last decade or more, and maybe this is an opportunity that could really change the game by bringing people together. And so I think this is a really interesting opportunity to see what the potential is and what the experience has been, and what's happened here in Washington State and where things are going to go. So the first presentation will be by Zsuzsa Nowak, talking about citizens' assemblies and the standards. And then we'll have presentations from Ed on the initiating the Washington Climate Assembly, from Mike Chang on Washington Climate Assembly reflections on how it worked, and then from Laura Berry looking at assemblies around the world and in the US context. And so I want to turn it over to Zsuzsa to begin.
Thank you, Dan. I'm going to share my presentation with everyone and get on it because I do not have a lot of time and there is a lot of things to cover. So like Dan said, I am Zsuzsa. I work at the Center for Climate Assemblies and I co-designed the Washington Climate Assembly, but I will give you a quick introduction into what citizens' assemblies are and the premise of deliberative democracy. Spoiler, the citizens' assemblies are one of the tools of deliberative democracy. I'll tell you a little bit about the CA standards, the key stages of the process, and what is the role of citizens' assemblies in the environmental context. So, deliberative democracy. This is a really quick, kind of like a definition from James Fishkin, who wrote several quite good books about deliberative democracy. I could highly recommend. To pursue deliberative democracy is to pursue the inclusion of everyone, but in conditions where they are successfully encouraged to really think about issues. You may want to pay attention to the parts that I highlighted because I will be referencing those and talking about how that's actually achieved in the citizens' assembly process, which, as I've said, is one of the tools of deliberative democracy. So the easiest way to talk about what a citizen's assembly is, rather than to give you a definition, is to just tell you what the process looks like. So there is 4 key stages to a citizens' assembly process: the sortition, the education or the learning phase, deliberation, and then finally recommendations. Sortition is just a fancy term, really, that refers to a random selection of a representative sample. So the people are selected at random, but the composition of the assembly is not really random because it has to represent the community where the assembly is being organized. So if a given community, let's say it's the Washington State, is 51% women, then the assembly sample, which may be 100 people, it may be 50 people or 80 people, has to be 51% women. And the demographic criteria that you use for the representativeness of the sample is going to vary. They are going to vary from assembly to assembly depending on the local context and the topic of the assembly and so on. And then the educational phase is the part where the assembly members, the randomly selected assembly members, actually meet with experts and with stakeholders to learn about the issue that they're going to be creating recommendations on. This is why it's called the learning phase. It's very informative, it's very awareness raising, and it's also public. So it's accessible to the community at large, not just the selected sample of assembly members. Then there is the deliberative phase. I'm sorry, it's very late in Poland, so if my English is not up to par, you have to be a little forgiving. The deliberative part is not open to the public. It's just accessed by the assembly members and the facilitators who support the assembly members. And this is the phase where the assembly members discuss proposed recommendations and their pros and cons, and then finally they take a vote and the recommendations are created through the assembly process. There's many reasons why this process looks the way it does. If you have questions about why it looks the way it does, then please save those for the Q&A portion, and I would love to talk about it. So there is the guiding principles that are really the root of the standards that I mentioned in the very beginning. The whole assembly process is organized in accordance to those standards, but those standards were really created upon this foundation that are the guiding principles. So there is, for the Washington state, there's 6 of those. The one that you see highlighted in purple is the one that is not in the Washington State Citizens Assembly rulebook. It's the one that is the most recent addition to ours as in Center for Climate Assemblies, thinking about the democracy and the democratic process. But the most important one that I think is the most relevant for the Assembly is that democracy is for everyone. And that in a democracy, the people are the sovereign. And this is really the most foundational thing about this whole Citizens Assembly ordeal, is that it's a way of handing power back to the people, which is the democratic ideal. And then, of course, the purpose of democracy is to improve quality of life, and that's what should be guiding the whole process and also the Assembly members. So moving on. I don't have a lot of time left. This is an excerpt, is that how it's pronounced, of the Assembly standards. There's way more of them. 12, I want to say, 13 in the most recent version. And then this is just the ones that I considered the most relevant, the most important, and of course, top of which is the random selection of the assembly members. Participating in a citizens' assembly should not be a result of a popularity contest, which is a format that we're very familiar with from elections. The reason why the assembly members are randomly selected is that you don't want there to be undue influence on them. And then the independence of the coordinating team is very important. I'm sure the next speakers, Ed and Mike, are going to maybe talk a little bit more about that. And then the credibility of the process. The wide range of perspectives really is most relevant when it comes to inviting different experts and different stakeholders to be part of the learning phase. And then, of course, visibility. So making sure that even though the assembly members themselves are a small sample of the community, that the community at large knows about the assembly, knows that the assembly is taking place, and has meaningful ways to give input to the assembly and observe at least the learning portion. So then, what is the role of citizen assemblies in the environmental context? You don't have to read this whole list. This is the list of the types of issues that citizens assemblies are best for, according to various literature. And I did some of the work for you, and I gave myself the liberty of highlighting which of these are the most connected to environmental issues. So as you can see here, there is a huge overlap. And this is kind of just a visual way of showing you why environmental issues are actually really a prime example of something that a citizens assembly process would be very good for. Now, it's very important to talk about what the role of citizens assemblies is and what it is not. So citizens assembly members through the citizens assembly get to express their desires and preferences and expected courses of action. So basically, they get to say what they want as the people, as the community, but their role is not to create legislation or create very complex political strategies. So they're really not going to replace authorities or politicians or experts. And that is not their job. So they're not coming for all of those other jobs. It's really just an addition, and it's one way of doing things that is supposed to complement the rest of the elements of the system that is already in place. And a quick word on what citizens' assemblies are and what they are not. I'm seeing that I have 2 minutes left, so I'm really going to have to be quick about this. They are, of course, a form of democratic decision-making, and a legitimate form at that. They sometimes get confused with polls or surveys, which there definitely are not. It's a more in-depth, a more complex process than this of extracting what is really the will of the people. And the will of the people is what democracy is built upon or should be built upon. Citizens' assemblies are not a task force. They are not a new congressional house or a new chamber of parliament. And again, as I said before, they are not going to replace experts or authorities. So just very, very quickly, because I probably have to wrap up soon, this is the short list of advantages and disadvantages of citizens' assemblies. Of course, I do citizens' assemblies for a living, so I'm a huge proponent of using them and using them to the best of their ability, but they have their disadvantages. They are not a cure-all for all of our political problems of the time. They provide inclusivity and equal opportunity, meaning that everybody has an equal chance of being selected to a citizens' assembly. They are representative, so they include historically marginalized groups of people. There are no glass ceilings to become a citizen assembly member. They're informative, they raise awareness, they are relatively inexpensive compared to other democratic tools such as referendums or elections. And they allow for a tailored design, and they're very fun if they're done right. And then the disadvantages, of course, is that they are there is a small sample of people that gets to participate in those. They're a relatively new tool, so usually to get an assembly started, you need to do a lot of outreach beforehand. They take time, so they're not great for dealing with emergencies. There are some political buy-in obstacles, and again, they require tailored design, which can also be a disadvantage. So that was all from me. You can contact me at the following email address, and with that, I will turn it over to Ed from the Washington Climate Assembly initiating team. Ed, over to you.
Thank you, Zuza. So I'm going to get my slides up here, if I can figure that out. Okay. All right, my name is Ed Chad, as Zuza said, and I'm with a group called People's Voice on Climate, and we are the ones who initiated the Washington Climate Assembly. And I'm going to talk about why and how we did it. So we go back to last year when a group of activists occupied the state capitol in Olympia, Washington for several weeks. And a big part of what they were demanding was greater action on climate. The problem, as we saw it, is that we're in a climate crisis and it's simply not being matched by political action, which Dan actually referred to. We saw the state falling short of even the old targets that they had set many years ago. Well, in 2020, they set new, better targets that were in line with the Paris Accord, but a number of key bills failed in the legislature last year. And so the gap between our targets and where we were going was just huge. So here we were in the Evergreen State with the climate governor, and we were just failing miserably. And you know, we felt, well, Washington should be a leader, and we're not. So how do we break through business as usual? Well, we were inspired by a group called Extinction Rebellion, who in the UK in 2019 shut down London for a couple of weeks. You might remember that. And they had three simple demands, simple but big demands of the British government. And the third demand was government must create and be led by the decisions of a citizens' assembly on climate and ecological justice. Well, our group liked that idea. And so we developed theory of change, more or less along the lines of what Zsuzsa talked about, that democracy should reflect the informed and discerning will of the people, that the standard political process is bogged down by special interest and partisanship, and that if you can get a group of ordinary people working together, they can solve problems in ways that politicians can't. So our first try was to try to market the assembly as a top-down project sponsored by the government. Other assemblies around the world were called for by citizen activists, but then they were convened by the governments. So we tried the same in Washington. We appealed to the governor and to the legislature. We got a little bit of lip service, but not much. And then COVID hit. And once that happened, we knew that the Washington government was not going to sponsor a citizens' assembly. So we went to Plan B, and that was to try to bootstrap the assembly from the bottom up. In the UK, their assembly had been formed by 6 key legislative committees. You'll see that in the table. We went to the equivalent committee chairs in the Washington House of Representatives to their respective chairs. And out of those, 5 of the 6 were willing to endorse the idea of an assembly. And lo and behold, on May 31st last year, they published a joint editorial in the Everett Herald calling for a citizens' assembly. However, it was clear that they weren't going to sponsor it themselves, and it was going to be up to us. Well, when government sponsors a project, it has a lot of resources that a little group of citizens doesn't have. They have staff, access to expertise, they have managed lots of projects, they already have the public eye, there's a sense of gravitas about them, and of course, if they want to do something, they'll fund it. Well, we didn't have any of that, but we did have some advantages that governments don't. So we were independent, and we were independent in a way that we could relinquish control over the assembly, in a way that a government just doesn't ever relinquish control of anything it's involved in. We were passionate people, but we were not partisan. So we would not be out to make the other side look bad or be accused of that. Because we were a small grassroots group, we had a certain appeal in that regard. People tended to listen to us. And also because we were a group of passionate people about climate, we were committed to press the assembly's findings onto the government once the assembly concluded. So we pieced it together little by little. First of all, we had pro bono expertise from Zsuzsa and some colleagues at the Center for Climate Assemblies. Without them, we never would have gotten a start on this thing. We also tried finding funding from some big donors, and we failed. And we actually put together the funding ourselves. It was a big lift. We managed to hire a couple of part-time staff, and we, among our group, put out a massive volunteer effort. We called upon community members to be involved, and we learned as we went, and slowly we built the structures and relationships that created the assembly. So a couple of challenges we faced. One is public recognition. How do you become a thing in the minds of people? Well, we did the best we could. We reached out to activists, networks, academics, politicians, tribes, business groups, and the media. We had our own social media. We had lots and lots of Zoom meetings, both large and small. And slowly we did build recognition, although it was not optimal. I would imagine that most of you never heard of the Washington Climate Assembly before this conference. And another challenge we faced is how does the initiating group keep at arm's length from the assembly itself? To be credible, the assembly has to be seen as fair and balanced. You can't be seen to be putting a finger on the scale. So to distance ourselves, we created a team that hired the coordinating team to run the assembly. So not only did we not run the assembly, but we weren't even the ones to choose the team to run the assembly. In addition to that, we formed a multi-party monitoring team to provide oversight for the assembly. And that ended up with 28 quite varied community members. So how did it turn out? Mike will talk more about that, but a little overview. It wasn't perfect, but it was the first climate assembly in the United States. And we think it was credible. We especially were inspired by the assembly members who just had a great sense of public spirit. They were very engaged with the subject matter and with one another. And they produced 148 recommendations that were certainly substantive. As Susie said, they were broad brush, and there are limitations to what an assembly can do. The legislative impact is harder to assess, and timing was an issue for this assembly. We wanted to get something done in time to possibly influence the 2021 legislative session. However, we were running at the same time the session was. By the time the recommendations came out, a lot of the proposed legislation was either well down the pipeline or was already dead. We are in process of promoting the Assembly's recommendations. So a brown bag was held with legislators, attended by about 50 people, where the members presented their recommendations. That chart you see is a sample from a crosswalk that was done between the Assembly recommendations and 2021 legislation. And we're planning more interactions between Assembly members and the legislators. In fact, we presented some testimony last week. The next step for People's Voice on Climate are to form partnerships with ally organizations. For example, we're working with the League of Women Voters. We're organizing Assembly members and others who are involved with the project who want to play a continuing role. We plan to promote future assemblies, and we're also going to improve the assembly delivery model because we've learned a lot in the course of doing what we did. So we invite you to get informed and get involved. Again, we're People's Voice on Climate. If you go on our website, there's a wealth of information there. It will also link you to the Assembly's own website, and you can also sign up for our newsletter for updates. So I thank you for your time, and I'm going to now pass it on, if I can figure out how to do this, with Mike Chang, who is going to talk about the coordinating team for the Assembly. Mike, take it away.
Great, thank you, Ed. Thank you, Zuza, and thank you to Dan and the conference organizers. So I'm going to be talking about the actual Washington Climate Assembly, the process and the actual project. And so just to briefly introduce myself, my name is Mike Chang, and I'm an associate at Cascadia Consulting Group. And I was part of the coordinating team. And so kind of what Ed and Zuza were talking about, we were the third party neutral facilitator that was brought into this process. And so today I'm just going to go over kind of what did the Climate Assembly talk about? Who were the Assembly members? What was the timeline and when did it happen? And how did we produce the recommendations? And so overall, the Washington Climate Assembly was convened to address this one question. How can Washington State equitably design and implement climate mitigation strategies while strengthening communities disproportionately impacted by climate change across the state? In addition to that, before we jump into the details, I also wanted to give an overview of who the Assembly members were. And so the Assembly members were comprised of 77 residents of Washington State that were gender balanced, ages range from 16, I think, all the way up to 80. They were representative of also every single congressional district. And you can see in the map to the right here, kind of the breakdown of how the congressional district participation shaped up to be. It was also representative of income level, race, ethnicity, and educational level, as well as political opinions and opinions about climate change. And so essentially what we wanted to make is that the Assembly members is a microcosm of Washington State's larger population and reflective of the state's demographics. So kind of going into the project process. So the whole project process took place over the course of 6 months, beginning in October and ending in late February. There were two main parts of the whole project: the design phase, which included the process of determining the rule book, which is the set of standards for how we run our assembly, as well as our question, who was presenting to our assembly, and recruiting our members. The assembly phase, as you can see in the purple on the right, is when we actually convened the assembly over the course of 7 weeks. Throughout this entire time, kind of what Ed said, there was also a monitoring team that essentially served as an independent watchdog of the coordinating team to ensure that we are adhering to the rule book. During the design phase, via 2 separate workshops, we determined the scoping question, as well as the criteria to select our climate assembly members, which I mentioned both of those in the first 2 slides. In addition to this, via additional engagement via experts, elected officials, interested parties, and practitioners, we will continue to refine the scoping question to make sure that the question we were asking and posing to the Assembly was as relevant to the priorities of the state legislature as possible. The Assembly itself was broken up into 3 parts: the learning session, the deliberative sessions, and a final voting session. So Assembly members heard from almost 50 experts and interested parties about a range of climate change topics, and they had an opportunity to ask questions to these presenters throughout every single one of our sessions. We had a total of 7 learning sessions spanning from the basics of climate change science to learning about the social, technical, economic, environmental, and political aspects of climate mitigation strategies and policies. We solicited kind of input for this learning phase agenda or syllabus, more so, from almost 30 climate scientists, experts, practitioners, and interested parties on how do we structure the learning phase of this assembly. And we got input on things from specific topics to recommendations on specific speakers, as well as the sequencing of topics too. The next phase was the deliberative phase of this assembly. And so this followed the learning sessions and took place over the course of 2.5 weeks. So within these deliberative sessions, assembly members had a chance to talk about what they learned with each other, their own views and priorities, while weighing the stances of other assembly members and shaping recommendations. Just like the learning sessions, each of these happened every Tuesday evening and Saturday morning. And so over the course of 7 weeks, the assembly members spent a total of 35 hours together. Finally, in the very last session was the voting session. And so this happened on February 27th. During the session, assembly members factored in public comments that were received during the public comment period in the week leading up to the voting session. They then used a secret ballot to vote on recommendations, which eventually led to a final set of recommendations that we synthesized and proposed to the state legislature for consideration. Throughout this, we also wanted to acknowledge that the meetings would be virtual. So the coordinating team did everything we could to virtually build community and increase accessibility and reduce barriers of participation. So in doing this, one of the main things is, since we were doing this completely remotely, we wanted to make sure that participation in the climate assembly was accessible and equitable for all. And we provided equipment such as laptops, Wi-Fi hotspots, microphones, video cameras, and printed and mailed materials to any of the assembly members that needed it. So now, going into the how were the recommendations produced. So prior to even begin thinking about the recommendations themselves, the Assembly members created and voted on a set of priority principles that they felt should underpin the Assembly and any legislative action. These priority principles were formed in our very first deliberative session and served as essentially the North Star in the Assembly evaluated proposed recommendations in all subsequent deliberative sessions and in their final vote. And you can see here on the right, there were 7 priority principles. Following the identification of these priority principles, the coordinating team used a process that led the Assembly members through iterative deliberations. And within these deliberations, we really wanted to construct a logic model of, we're not just offering these recommendations in a vacuum, but we're connecting them to specific problems and considerations, as well as to a future vision that the Assembly members wanted to see for themselves. We also set community agreements to set expectations of respect and rules of deliberation with each other. Again, we had 77 people from across the state of Washington reflecting a lot of different viewpoints. And so we wanted to make sure that any deliberation was respectful and productive. And finally, there was a focus on solutions that had broad input across all of the Assembly members as well. So finally, in our very last session, we held a vote on all of the proposed recommendations via a secret ballot. So the Assembly process is designed for recommendations to emerge through deliberative democracy, but for a recommendation to be approved, there are very high thresholds that each recommendation needs to pass. In the final vote, Assembly members were asked to vote on each proposed recommendation using the secret ballot you can see on the right-hand side of your screen, ranging from I strongly agree to I strongly disagree. The top 3 ballot choices in green, I strongly agree, I agree, and agree with reservations, indicate support for a recommendation. So for a recommendation to be approved, it needed to receive at least 80% support from Assembly members and have a strength of support score, or the average score of all points granted, to be 1.75 or more. So if a recommendation did not meet both of these criteria, then it was not considered to be approved or a formal recommendation from the Assembly process. In the end, we had over 140 recommendations that were approved by the Climate Assembly members. So some of the specific recommendations you can see here include touch upon sectors related to transportation, buildings, energy, the environment, as well as circular economies, social policies, education, and communication and governance. And I think if you're on SwapCard, there should be links to the full report that dive deeper into each of these recommendations. But kind of building on what Ed was saying before, is that a lot of the recommendations that the Assembly members approved are actually being considered in the current legislative session. So you can see here, here are some examples of recommendations approved by the Assembly, as well as the corresponding bill, proposed bill within the current legislative session. So I'm going to wait a second just so people can read. And you can see in the bold italicized that both indicates the strength of support, as well as how, so the percent of people who had a positive or affirmative vote on this recommendation, as well as the strength of the score. And finally, we just wanted to bring it back is that this Assembly members was really, or this is Climate Assembly was really about the Assembly members themselves. And so here are some testimonials that we were able to get following the last Climate Assembly. So with that, thank you again to everyone, and thank you for attending today. And now I'm going to pass the microphone over to Laura Berry, who's going to wrap us up. So thank you all.
Great, thank you, Mike. So I am going to finish up by taking us actually a little bit farther out from where we've been focusing for the past 30 minutes with our previous presenters. So we're actually, in this last session, I am actually going to talk a little bit about the role of what we see as actually democracy in the United States in the context of the rise of climate assemblies and other deliberative democratic innovations across the world. And my name is Laura. I have been working with the People's Voice on Climate for over 2 years now as an advisor. I'm a climate policy specialist and also served on the monitoring team for the Washington State Climate Assembly. So have been very lucky to be very close to all of this process. So I first wanted to, like I said, zoom out to the global level and talk a little bit about what practitioners and academics have been calling the global deliberative wave. So as you can see, the Climate Assembly in Washington State has been one of multiple, over 100 at this point, democratic deliberative experiments across the world, looking at topics not just climate change, but from healthcare reform to COVID-19. There have been a number of citizens' assemblies on COVID-19 to even constitutional reform in certain places. And this is really critical because, as Zuza had mentioned, climate assemblies and other deliberative innovations that use mini publics, these representative samples, are really critical and a very useful tool to actually dive into very difficult political issues, these issues that have perhaps a high level of partisanship or are difficult for politicians to actually address. But climate assemblies are sort of the most well-known in a lot of ways. If you've heard of a citizens' assembly, you likely have heard of a climate assembly specifically. We'll talk a little bit about 2 specific national climate assemblies in the UK and France a little later on. But there's also, for example, right now, a global climate assembly being designed and delivered up to COP26 in Glasgow, the large UNFCCC climate conference. So this is something that, broadly speaking, is happening all over the world and is only sort of really getting its footing in the United States. So I wanted to start off with some framing and a very long quote by Rebecca Willis, who is the lead expert on the UK Citizens Assembly on climate change. And it's to kind of put into context what she says: our existing political system needs to be understood as embedded within a society that has taken 2 things for granted: a stable climate and plentiful fossil fuels. And what she argues in her book about democracy and climate change is that while polls show that people care, a majority of people care about climate change, think we need to do more, this generalized concern might not translate into support for specific strategies or even politicians doing anything about it. And then there is what she says in the last paragraph, a further danger where if politicians aren't feeling pressure from constituents to speak out, then their fellow politicians won't speak out. So it's this sort of vicious cycle, a silent standoff where neither politicians nor people are really willing to make the move of saying, this is what we need to do about climate change, and this is really how we should do it. So this is just some context for sort of what I'm going to talk about in terms of the global rise of climate assemblies and what we're doing here in the US. But let's back up for a moment. So Ed mentioned that climate assemblies, the Washington State Climate Assembly was an example of this, but also the 2 sort of ones I'm going to talk about, the UK Climate Assembly and the French Citizens Convention, both were initiated in part because of protests. So the Extinction Rebellion protests in London, as he mentioned, they had declaring a climate emergency as one of their demands, but also actually installing a citizens' assembly to guide policymaking. And in France, the Yellow Vest protests were in due part because of seen as unjust climate policy, fuel taxes specifically, that led to President Macron actually assembling a climate assembly to deal with these issues. But what we see, this sort of rise in climate activism since 2017 with the youth climate movement and others, is that there is really this lack of trust in government officials and policymakers to really do the deliberation themselves in a lot of ways, to actually figure out what the best, most equitable and effective climate policies we need to take. And what this has led to, at least in the context of some citizens' assemblies, is protesters demanding process demands rather than sort of outcome demands, specific policies. And I can just speak a little bit to the French and UK assemblies. My presentation will be available so you can read through this as well. But Claire Mellier, who is a researcher from the UK Climate Assembly, made this comparison. And these are real large institutions now, these democratic deliberative processes. The UK and French climate assemblies are national, and so we're much bigger than the Washington state ones. So they took months rather than weeks. Pretty large budgets, although the French case was much larger. And then I think the key point here is, though, the recommendations that each of these assemblies came out with were actually much stronger than any of the recommendations that politicians in these countries had actually been able to come up with themselves. And I would actually argue that while Mike is right in that there are some recommendations that are reflected in current legislation being deliberated in Washington state right now, that some of the recommendations generated by the Washington Climate Assembly are actually above and beyond what is seen as politically possible. So what does this mean in the US context? So as I mentioned, we've known for a long time that it's not actually as partisan an issue as we think it is, climate change. 65% of Americans want the federal government to do more on climate change. This was in the midst of the 2020 elections. We knew that across parties, we have a majority of people who want climate action. But we are struggling, I think, in a lot of ways in the United States to really figure out how to translate that into action, especially from the perspective of climate activism. Because what we've seen actually in the past couple of years has been a rise in the scale and speed of climate demands. So we see the Green New Deal, we see youth climate protests, and we see at the corner, or at the sort of keystone of this, is politicians, specific people, specific champions who we say we need to elect these people into office so that they can give us what we want. And this is coming for reference as 10 years as a climate activist, but also someone very deeply involved in deliberative democracy. This strategy seems to be working to a certain extent, but also is very difficult, I think. The Green New Deal, for example, as sort of the meme of climate policy, the thing that we are all striving towards, doesn't really say very much about, or at least most policy proposals don't say very much about the role of citizen participation or individual participation. It's very focused on what I would call outcome equity, in the sense of saying, we need to invest a certain percentage of climate funding into disadvantaged communities and marginalized communities, which is absolutely true. But the question is, where do those communities themselves have a voice in actually shaping that policy process? So these are questions that, as we've been working through the Washington State Climate Assembly process, have really been at the forefront of our minds in terms of where we go next. So deliberative democracy, even if you might not have heard of it, does actually have a history in the United States. We've had the American one room process, might be something that you've heard of. It took place before the 2020 elections, similarly trying to bring people together to talk about a number of issues, from healthcare to climate change to economic reform and inequality. And this was really trying to sort of get a sense of the political polarization in the US. And to no surprise of anybody involved in deliberative democracy programs, it was actually really successful. People were able to come to near consensus on these critical issues. You have the ongoing demand from Extinction Rebellion, New York City, for the state to actually, and the city to host citizens' assemblies. But we also have the history of deliberative polling in Texas, where I'm from, which actually helped lead to the rise of renewable energy in the state, which is an interesting story that I don't have time to tell, unfortunately. But we can ask, please feel free to ask questions about it. So where does this leave us? Ultimately, I see, as a climate activist and a researcher involved in these citizens' assemblies, it leaves us with the question of what kinds of democracy do we really need to address the climate emergency right now? Americans are very comfortable with our understanding of the US as, if you've ever heard, as a republic, not a democracy. And so our representative democracy is how we think of interacting with the democratic process in a lot of ways. But citizens' assemblies and deliberative democracy is really changing that field. So I would encourage people to think about this. What is the role of participation? What is the role of deliberation of people who aren't experts, of people who aren't people, sort of sitting in Congress or at the EPA or otherwise? So here's some long takeaways. I realize I only have a couple seconds left, so we can run through these fairly quick. Essentially, Experiments in deliberative democracy are continuing. The COVID-19 pandemic slowed some down, but there have been amazing democratic innovations in the online space. Climate change, as Zuza said, is specifically well suited to be dealt with through deliberation, and we really do need it. We need more democracy to effectively and equitably address it. And then we have some critical opportunities in the US climate movement to translate public support for climate action into tangible pathways through citizens' assemblies, also to build political pressure and hold policymakers accountable to those recommendations, and also to actually take democracy as climate reform, as a stance within our work, within our activism, and within the things that we do. Because ultimately, climate change is a social issue, not just a technocratic one, and we should act like it. But with that, I'm going to pass it back to Dan since I'm a couple seconds over, and thank you very much for your time.
All right. Well, thank you very much for really engaging presentations. I think gave us all a good perspective and overview of the process, both globally and here in Washington State. I'd encourage all the audience members to pose questions in the chat box. I'll pose one while you're thinking about those, and that is, were there any particularly noteworthy or unexpected or creative recommendations coming out of this assembly in Washington State? I'll open that to anybody, but you have to take your stuff off mute. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I can go and just start with two that I think were particularly noteworthy. One, I think there is, I think personally, this is the first People's Assembly or Citizen Assembly I have participated in. And about halfway through, I think that's when there was a lot of, the assembly members were feeling a lot of ownership and agency within the process. And then they actually proposed a new recommendation that the state of Washington should just have regular climate assemblies to address this topic. And I think that was kind of an aha moment for myself about like, wow, this is working, as well as kind of an aha moment for the participants as well. I would also say that, again, I think this isn't a specific recommendation that comes to mind. I would say this is a specific consideration, is that I think in Washington State, there's a huge spectrum of rural communities to urban communities. And I think there was a lot of intentionality about how can we identify recommendations that serve all. And I think a lot of that was really kind of, again, deferring to communities, kind of what Laura was saying. And I think that's been a theme that we've been hearing throughout this conference and a lot of the presentations that I know that I've personally seen, is that how can we kind of give agency back to communities and some of their own decision making to make sure that they can best prioritize what their communities needs. And I think that's true, because what might work for one community might not work for another community, depending on context and things like that. So I'll stop there and see if other people want to jump in too.
Ed?
Yeah, on that slide that Mike showed, the third of the three crosswalk recommendations he showed was a very clear mandate for putting a price on carbon and devoting that funding to basically clean energy in an equitable way. And I think that's remarkable in a way, because Washington State's been attempting to pass some kind of price on carbon for years. Many attempts have been made, and they've all failed, and including twice initiatives failed. And I think it shows the difference between an initiative, which is just a big public thing where a lot of money gets spent. The last carbon tax initiative had $32 million spent to defeat it. Huge difference between that process and this kind of citizens assembly.
Something I'll just sort of add on that, with regards to the specific recommendation, while citizens assemblies are generally useful for more broad brush recommendations, there were really specific equity considerations baked into that last recommendation. I think that the citizens assembly process really tries to take into consideration that political context of how difficult a specific issue is, and then come up with some sort of resolution that actually does reflect the interests of that group of people in a way that is very specific. And I think that that's actually something that the Washington State Climate Assembly did really well. Was it centered equity at the very beginning, and so that consideration, even in the wording, is evident around a very politically polarizing issue in the state.
Great. Another question that came in, a couple of the presenters mentioned that the Assembly's recommendations were stronger and go further than we typically see in the political proposals. Is there a possibility that happens because there are fewer considerations or less information about the costs, literal or metaphorical, of certain recommendations?
I can take that one. Or Zuza, no,
go
you
ahead. No, go ahead.
So since I know that I had said that as well, in the case of the UK Climate Assembly, it wasn't a sort of an always yes or an always no. There were certain recommendations that did go farther, or proposed recommendations that went farther, that were rejected by the Citizens Assembly, for example, to do basically to cut carbon emissions faster than a certain proposal. That was actually said, we don't need to do that based on the risk assessment. But, ultimately in the learning phase, that includes basically the costs, information about the costs of different measures, as well as the costs of inaction. I think is sort of the flip side of that question, is what happens if we don't take action at this speed and scale that's being proposed, and that can take place in terms of economic cost or social costs, flooding, wildfires, et cetera. So, but experts attempt to basically give us as full of a picture as possible to the different assembly members so that they can make those informed decisions based on their values and their judgment as individuals and as sort of people within their communities.
Any other, Ed?
Yeah, to hop on top of that, there have been citizens deliberative democracy processes specifically aimed at things like budget priorities that required the people that came together to weigh things against one another and think about trade-offs. And this assembly was limited in the amount of time it had, considering how much time it had and the fire hose of information that came at it. It's quite remarkable what the recommendations were, but further elaborations of this can happen. It's just a matter of what the focus would be, and there's nothing that would keep a group of citizens from looking into more detail or more nuance. It's just a matter of prioritizing that.
Zuza.
So just very quickly, from a practitioner's perspective, a very good idea of something to include in the assembly process is cost assessment by local authorities. You can actually take proposed recommendations, pass them on to, like if you're doing an assembly at a city level, pass them on to the municipality to put a price tag on all of those, and then feed them back to the assembly members with that cost assessment attached. This is something that we're actually doing in our citizens assembly process right now in Poland, and that's a very good idea because it, like I said, every feature of the assembly design roots from the guiding principles, and one of those is that the purpose of democracy is to produce quality, well thought out decisions. So if you want people to be able to make informed decisions, they also need to be informed about what it would cost and what they would have to give up in return. So that's just from a practical perspective, is that this is something you can include in the process itself.
That's a great, thank you, Suzanne. That's a great segue to the next question, which is posed to Ed and Mike, but probably open to everybody here. What challenges did you encounter in the process of the Washington Climate Assembly, and what would you do differently if you were starting a new one? Who wants to take that?
Maybe I could start and then hand it to Ed. I think some of the challenges that we encountered in this process, I think, mostly stems from the remote nature of this. Kind of what Laura said is, so what's true is a lot of these types of citizens or people's assembly have been moving forward during the time of COVID. But obviously before that, a lot of them were in-person events. And so I think some of the challenges really struck on how do we make sure that 77 people feel really heard across an online and remote setting. I think kind of there were ways that we can still reduce technological barriers of participation by providing laptops, Wi-Fi hotspots, printed materials, and a range of other things. But that also still didn't always mean that people felt comfortable using it. And so I think how we also addressed is we had 1 to 2 people standing by on just tech issues. And it was really funny because our tech person became really good friends with some of the assembly members because they were calling him so much as well. So I think that was one of the big challenges. And I think kind of what Ed was alluding to previously is if we had to restart this whole process again, is that more time, I think more time kind of is always, we were kind of in a crunched phase, just kind of aligning this assembly with the current legislative session. But I think with more time, there can be a lot more intention and a lot more opportunity to make sure we give enough time for deliberation too. And so I think that can help with the design as well as implementing the assembly.
Yeah, to elaborate on that, I think that it would have made it a lot easier for the assembly members if while the presentations were being given, there was more time for the members to talk about what they were hearing and synthesize it. Because of the press of time, instead, there were pretty much just this flow of information coming at them, and then the deliberation started. And the other thing that was a definite handicap is that it had never been done before in the United States. Nobody really knew what it was, and it wasn't the government sponsoring it. So it was this group of people, and the group of people wasn't even a known organization. It was just this group of people. Made it really hard to gain any kind of traction in people's minds. So it would definitely help. I mean, it was great that we put it together, but it would definitely help to at least have more of a stamp from a government on, we think this is a good idea, just that more people would know about it.
So we have 3 minutes left. I'm going to give you one more question, and then I'm going to give you hopefully a chance to say a last thought about what you think the impact of this whole thing was as you wrap up. The last question here is, what do you think about climate adaptation? Do you feel that the Assembly in Washington State should put equal or more attention to adaptation planning to deal with pending climate impacts? So did that get sort of climate adaptation, did that get equal billing with mitigation?
Well, I'll address that. So because it was this small group of activists who put this assembly together, we got to set what the basic topic was going to be. Now, we didn't set the question, but we did say that we wanted to be about mitigation. And the reason we said that is that's, if we're going to really try to address the climate crisis, we need to prioritize mitigation right away. We will have to also prioritize adaptation. And in fact, one of the implications of what Laura said is that there's going to be more and more of a need for deliberative approaches to looking at the problems we know we're not going to be able to avoid, no matter how much mitigation we're able to do. It'll just get more and more necessary.
Yeah. And if I can just jump in really quickly, I also say that even though climate adaptation is important, I'd also say as everyday kind of people who live in Washington State participating in this, I think the delineation that people who work in this space between climate mitigation versus climate adaptation, that's kind of one of the additional pluses, is that I think when people were thinking about things around transportation access, things around health and healthcare access. Those are also adaptation and resilience building strategies as well. And I think because a lot of these people don't live and breathe kind of the climate sciences or the climate practice or be on the climate practitioner side of things, they didn't have that kind of framework coming into this. So I think just because it was focused, the question was focused on climate mitigation, I think there's a lot of other adaptation and resilience related actions within their recommendations as well.
Great, thank you. We have run out of time, so I don't get to ask that last question about impact, but hopefully you'll have opportunities to chat with people along the way. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, presenters, for a great presentation and a great session, and thank you to the audience for great questions.